Greetings, this is the Grumpy Old Slan, and today we're going to look at the January 1924 issue of Weird Tales, starting with the cover art, which is signed Malley. I like this one a lot more than the previous issue, showing a cowboy being pursued by a ghost rider of some sort. Western tales often had stories of haunted mines and ghost towns. The reason for those was never supernatural, but here they're explicitly giving you a ghostly rider. Don't know if there's a story related to this cover. Hopefully there is. Could be nice. The last few covers were just mood pieces, essentially. So let's get into this issue. Again, the table of contents is near the end. We have 13 stories, 2 of which are serials. The first story is The Abysmal Horror. This one starts with a meteor landing on Earth or coming near Earth, and in the weeks and months that follow, more and more strange things are happening. Namely, these plants that no one's ever seen before start to move. They grab people and kill them and will consume them. These plants get bigger and bigger. They're not just on land, they're also in the ocean, where they've grown entirely unnoticed till they're huge and they can sink ships and whatnot. The main character here, who narrates the story, encountered these plants. One afternoon he's at a fishing hole, he's lying in the grass, and next thing he knows, some plants are over his legs and one of his arms. He manages to pull away and survive, though he is bleeding from the plant trying to reach his blood and pump it out of him. He survives, but then he talks about the different things he witnesses as things go forward. Eventually, the army tries to fight back. They show a failed attempt at destroying this botanical threat. To find out how it's going to end, we'll need to read the conclusion in the next issue. The next story is Black Sorcery. The narrator's a colonial administrator of some sort in Eastern Africa. He's been in this tiny little village for years now. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, this couple shows up from England, some well-to-do people, and they take this as like being tourists, and they don't take it seriously. Eventually, they will run across a witch doctor. He is trying to write a book on these things. He wants to observe a ceremony. He's promised there will be a sacrifice. Both he and his wife show up. The colonial administrator accompanies them, though he's reluctant and he keeps trying to get them to not go, but he feels if he's there, he could maybe mitigate the situation, whereas if he's not there, things could really go bad. Of course, in spite of him being there, they go bad. She seems to be possessed by some sort of demon. He apparently disappears. Eventually, he will reappear 100 miles away in another village. Weeks later, no one knows how he got there. He's half-starved and he won't survive the ordeal. But meanwhile, the administrator, who knows this witch doctor a little bit, will go to him and say, look, you have to get the demon out of her. He gets him to do that. So at least things end okay for her, though she is forever changed by the experience. It has some ambiguity as to whether or not there really is a demon, or if it was just some sort of drug or something that the witch doctor had the woman consume, causing her to act strangely and to never quite recover. I quite enjoy this kind of ambiguity in stories. So next we had The Hand of Fatma, which is mostly just one very big long coincidence. It's about a man who is stationed in Algeria. He hides the fact from his family, but he has a child there, an illegitimate child from a local woman. He'll go back to England. He has a daughter in England. Eventually, she will make her way back to Algeria because she's always wanted to visit it, having heard stories of it when she was young. And she will come across her brother, whom she does not know exists. Very much in the tradition of the let's have a whole bunch of unlikely coincidences type stories. I don't enjoy these too much. They become kind of predictable in a way once you realize that that's what it is. The Man Who Banished Himself is very odd story for the time. It seems like everything is what a man who is very ill and very delirious is experiencing. I'll say it was interesting. I can't say I greatly enjoyed it either. It feels like a stream of consciousness story. It's got those disconnects that stream of consciousness sometimes have. You jump from one place to the other, apparently. It's not very narrative. It's more about experience than events. Next, we have a short poem by Preston Langley Hickey called Hops. This poem didn't do too much for me. The final line, "'Tis a dream I've had and that is all." I've never liked the "it was all a dream" endings for most stories, and I don't like it much more when it's in a poem. Next, we have A Game of Chance, whose narrator is a doctor in a hospital. This happens at night. He wants to work on his experiments while it's quiet, but a patient arrives in an ambulance, but she's declared dead on arrival. She's brought to the morgue, and then it turns out there are two men who claim to be her husband, which is strange enough, and he figures this will all be worked out in the morning. However, this doctor is a bit of an unsavory type, and he decides he needs some organs from one of the bodies for his experiment, and he will go and take one from one of the bodies in the morgue. As he's there, the two men arrive, each independently, intent on grabbing the body and leaving with it so they can bury it. He hides. They start to argue, and eventually they decide to gamble the body between each other playing dice. On this scene, the doctor decides he will exit. This was a disappointing story. In fact, when I got to the end of it, I thought something was missing because there's a whole bunch of stuff set up. His experiments, there's a nurse, they seem to be involved. This doesn't go anywhere. And then poof, the story ends on him sneaking out of the morgue while the two men are throwing dice, and that's it. A very disappointing and skippable story. Very disconnected. At the end of this story is a poem called Solution by Clark Ashton Smith. This is his second poem in the pages of Weird Tales, and it's quite a welcome sight, especially after the disappointing story that preceded it. Next, we have The Open Window. Once again, we have a story within a story where someone recalls a tale of something that he witnessed when he was in the jungles of India. How a companion of his died a horrible death to a strange creature that left a strange scar. As he tells the tale, he notices that the window of the room is open and sort of panics and closes it. The next morning, he is found dead in his room. The window is open, and he has the same kind of strange wound that he described in his tale. So we don't describe the cause of the horror, we just describe its effects, so we actually don't know what the monster is at all. There's also an interesting little hint that the person who heard the tale might be thinking that he's next, although it's not explicitly stated. It concludes with him becoming nervous about the same things that his dead companion was. We also have a short poem called The Cataleptic by Charles Lane. Very nice imagery in this one. Puts you in the right mood for some horror, that's for sure. Next, we have The Cat Called Carlos. This one about a widow who has a very large cat, which she calls Carlos, which happens to be the name of her dead son. A man who courted her before she got married and never accepted that she married someone else comes back in the village. Eventually, they have a confrontation. This is witnessed by the narrator, who was quite young at the time. What happens is that at the edge of a cliff, he will kill her, but the cat will jump at him, and in the struggle he will fall. When the narrator and his father climb down to find the body, they find no sign of the cat. I found that was a bit of a letdown. Cats are well known to survive very big falls. There was an attempt at shocking, hinting at the supernatural with the cat having disappeared, but it fell flat. We next have the second Lovecraft tale to be published in Weird Tales. This one is called The Picture in the House, which is a bit of an odd title for this one, for the picture is in a book that's in a house. It also is the first mention of Arkham and the Miskatonic Valley and that whole New England setting, although the tale itself doesn't have anything to do with the other things we've come to associate with it. It's a Lovecraft tale, although it's a little bit more explicit than most of his. The buildup is quite nice in this one, all the way to the final sentence, which doesn't outright tell us what will happen to the protagonist, but makes it clear nevertheless. Another fine tale by Lovecraft. You can see why this was also a story that impressed the editors of Weird Tales. Next, we have the second installment of Draconda, the space fantasy. In the last installments, they were just approaching Venus after weeks of travel, and now they land and they find a world that's very cloudy, but otherwise very similar to Earth. They find plants and animals that look familiar. This does lead to a debate between the characters where some believe that it debunks evolution and proves God. Others reserve judgment. I'm surprised convergent evolution wasn't mentioned because it was already well over 50-year-old idea. So they will land on a small island. They will find some plants and animals that look familiar. They'll hunt down a deer, eat the game. Oh, it's yummy. Decide to go exploring further. They see signs of what might be civilization, but they're not sure, so they decide to build a raft and cross the water from the island to shore, which isn't very far away. And while they're there exploring, a meteor happens to land right where their spaceship was, leaving them stranded. And this installment ends with them finding the footprint of a naked human foot in the earth near a small spring. So will they meet this human? Who is it? We don't know. We will find out in the next issue. This was a quite fun one. I enjoy these old-fashioned space fantasies. They're more adventure tales set in an exotic locale. Could be South America, Africa, or Venus. Otherwise, it's mostly told the same way. It's just they get to add more exotic things to the adventure. This is the longest serial that Weird Tales has published so far. All the others were only two-parters, and this one has 5 or 6 if I recall. So looking forward to the next one. And then we have The Hook of Death, which is the story of a haunted house. In this one, someone inherits all of his uncle's belongings, including a house, and it's been several years since his uncle passed away because it took this long for the lawyer to be able to track him down. He's the only surviving relative. When he states his intention of moving into the uncle's old house, which he remembers from when he was a small child, people try to discourage him, saying it's haunted. He ignores this and will move in, although getting there is a challenge in itself. The house is in a small town. The one cab driver refuses to drive him to the house after sundown. Everyone seems to be terrified of the place. He still manages to hire some staff who will clean up and repair the house, but they'll only be there after sunup and before sundown. And in the first night he sleeps there, he will see what appears to be a ghost of his uncle. He knows this because instead of a hand, the uncle had an amputated hand, had this big metal hook in its stead, and he sees such a hook floating in the air. Eventually the mystery will be resolved. It is a newly arrived townsperson who has been scaring people away, making people believe this is a haunted house because it is near a river. There's a trapdoor in the wharf. He digs a tunnel to the basement of the house and he uses it to smuggle. That's the end of the story. D&D players will certainly see parallels with Saltmarsh. Obviously, this was written way before, and it's also not the first story in Weird Tales where people who are doing something illicit are trying to scare people away. This was a fun one, though a little bit too pat in its conclusion, which is of the type of, I've already called the police, they're on their way, you will get arrested. The utter trust that this is actually what's going to happen is not what we would see in a more modern story, but it's still relatively satisfying tale. Next, we have The Monstrosity. This is a story in two parts. The first one is a local in a small isolated village talking about a doctor who came to live in the village, how he kept to himself, and how eventually some strange beast started attacking people. The narrator suspects that it might be an animal in an enclosed cage, like a very big box, that was delivered to the doctor. After some people disappear, they will eventually start to hunt it down successfully, and it will turn out to be a blind young man that was living with the doctor, and they kill him near the doctor's house, thinking it's the beast. Then, trying to get in touch with the doctor, eventually enter his house and find out he's been dead for a while, killed by the monstrosity in question. And the second part is the diary that they find and that the narrator will read. It's the doctor's diary, and we come to find out that the young man was indeed blind. The doctor had a revolutionary operation of grafting new eyes in order to give him back his sight. The reason the doctor came to this isolated village was the father of the young man refused to have him perform this operation. He bemoans the fact that if he'd been in Vienna, he would have had better equipment, better installations to do it. But he made do, and it was successful. And what he did was graft the eyes of a leopard onto the young man. This will cause the young man to go more and more savage, less and less human, as though the way he sees the leopard's eyes rewire his brain. This is one of those stories told with very hillbilly way of talking, where instead of ing, every verb ends in in apostrophe. Everybody's willing and talking. It's a way to do the world building. Clearly establishes the narrator and his companions as people who have never really left the area they live in and don't know much about the outside world. They've sort of heard of Europe, but it's this incredibly exotic place. And the diary was a good way to explain what had actually happened. The story reminds me in many ways of The Hands of Orlac. Now, this was January 1924. The movie came out in 1924. I'm not sure when exactly, but the novel had been out for a few years already. It was published in French in 1920, and there were several translations. Did the book inspire this story? I have no way of knowing. On the other hand, this is only 6 years after the end of World War I. There were a lot of soldiers who'd come back home with missing limbs and other long-term consequences of the battles they were in. So the idea of replacing lost limbs or eyes or other things was certainly in people's minds because of this. So maybe it's just a case of coincidence. Nevertheless, it was well written, though you have to go through the very colloquial first part, and I know some people really don't like that kind of writing. The next story is called The Cobra Lily. This one is about a man who decides to mount an expedition to Yucatan, getting new specimens of plants, maybe animals, maybe some archaeology, the very generic expedition to remote jungles. On the cruiser, on the way there, he will meet a young woman who is from that area, who will sketch out for him a very strange flower. He will put it with his other papers, hire a local guide who comes with good references and so forth, and they will start exploring and looking for things. And going through his papers at some point, he will see the sketch that the young woman had made for him. He will show it to this guide who clearly recognizes this plant but refuses at first to show it to him, saying it would put his life in danger. He will force the guide to show him. The guide will bring him in the middle of the night to these old ruins, some sort of temple. He will there see the young woman who seems to be the priestess in a weird cult centered around this plant, and they will bring a young boy. One of the things about this plant is it has a long stalk in the middle, and it seems to move around, swaying to music. Eventually it will apparently sting the young man and he will die. The guide will get him to retreat, and a day or two after that they will come back. He will grab the specimen, put it in a crate, and get back to the US. As they're doing this, they're being pursued by locals. The guide will come back to the US with him. And it turns out that he's quite well educated. He knows French, he's been to Europe, and he will now be hired on as a butler of sorts by this explorer. Eventually, the priestess will catch up to them. He will exhibit his plant. The priestess will try to kill his fiancée with the plant. They struggle, and it turns out the priestess is apparently stung by the plant, and she doesn't die, but she becomes comatose. When they bring a doctor to examine her, he can't find any trace of poison in the blood sample. The only thing there is a small sting where the plant would have stung her. The plant has no poison. They analyze it. They can't figure it out. And eventually the guide says, let me bring her back to the Yucatan. Our people have ways that are beyond modern medicine. The explorer agrees and says, I'll go back. He feels responsible. Eventually, the priestess will be cured and he will be allowed to leave. It's an interesting adventure tale because it's not just one simple, let's go bring back something and the bad thing happens. In fact, the plant, it turns out, is not poisonous. This is something staged. So are its movements. It's being manipulated by someone hiding behind it. One of the interesting twists is the level of education and worldliness of the native guide, who, while he is native, has seen more of the world. The rant he goes into when things go bad about, I warned you, and in your arrogance you had to ignore all warnings, and you forced me to do this, and this is all on you for ignoring warnings you were given by people who knew better. That was an interesting little rant, and it's quite nice to see, giving more agency and more presence to the native, and also showing that natives aren't necessarily people who never left their area. Next, we again have the Weird Crimes column by Seabury Quinn. This one is titled The Magic Mirror Murders, and it concerns a man who would tell girls that he had a magic mirror, and if they looked in it, they would see the face of the man they would marry, and he would do this for free. Now, he would also tell them to wear their finest clothes, since they'll want to look nice for their future husband, and then when they would arrive, he would show them the mirror, and as they started to look, he would kill them carefully to not damage their clothes, and he would take all their possessions and sell it. Rather gruesome. This feels more fictional in the telling than factual, but who knows, maybe it is based on a real case. Finally, again, we have masterpieces of weird fiction. This one is The Black Cat by Edgar Allan Poe. Another classic with a protagonist who goes insane. And don't get me wrong, I really like Edgar Allan Poe. So far we've had The Murders in the Rue Morgue, we've had The Pit and the Pendulum, The Telltale Heart, and now The Black Cat. That's a lot of stories for a single author to dominate this, and I do hope they can find a greater variety. Otherwise, it accomplishes the opposite of what they probably want to do, which is show just how old and broad weird fiction was. If you focus everything on one writer, it kind of has the opposite effect. Nevertheless, this is a great story with a protagonist who, while he starts like a very nice person, becomes crazier and more violent as the tale progresses until gruesome murder ensues. And finally, we have the Eerie. We are starting to see some feedback by readers on the H.P. Lovecraft stories that have been published so far, which is quite nice. People quite like them. This has been the Grumpy Old Slan, reading the January 1924 issue of Weird Tales, and I'll see you next time.